Good plan. All right, Bobby, take it away.
Okay, you guys, it was really good that we went over our rules because and Pippi Longstocking, she's been invited to a coffee party with Annika and Tommy's mother. And she just ripped through all the rules. And it was sort of neat that we were talking about Thanksgiving and food because this is what this chapter is all about. How not to impress your hostess, okay? So Pippi goes to a coffee party. Tommy and Annika's mother had invited a few ladies to a coffee party. And as she had done plenty of baking, she thought Tommy and Annika might invite Pippi over at the same time. The children would entertain each other and give no trouble to anyone. Tommy and Annika were overjoyed when their mother told them and immediately dashed over to Pippi's to invite her. Pippi was in the garden watering the few flowers still in bloom with an old rusty watering can. As it was raining cats and dogs that day, Tommy told Pippi her watering seemed hardly necessary. Yes, that's what you say, said Pippi grudgingly, but I've lain awake all night thinking what fun it was going to be to get up and water, and I'm not going to let a little rain stand in my way. Now Annika came forth with the delightful news about the coffee party. A coffee party? Me? Cried Pippi, and she was so excited she began to water Tommy instead of the rose bush she intended to sprinkle. Oh, what will happen? Oh, I'm so nervous. What if I can't behave myself? Oh, of course you can, said Annika. Don't you be too certain about that, said Pippi. You can be sure I'll try, but I have noticed several times that people don't think I know how to behave, even when I'm trying as hard as I can. At sea, we were never so fussy about things like that, but I promise I'll take special pains today so you won't be ashamed of me. Oh, good, said Tommy, and he and Annika hurried home again in the rain. That afternoon, 3 o'clock, don't forget, cried Annika, peeking out from under the umbrella. At 3 o'clock, a very stylish young lady walked up the steps of the Stutzigren's house. It was Pippi Longstocking. For this special occasion, she had unbraided her pigtails, and her red hair hung like a lion's mane all around her. With red crayon, she had painted her mouth fiery red, and she had blackened her eyebrows so that she looked almost dangerous. With the crayon, she had also painted her fingernails, and she had put big green rosettes on her shoes. I should imagine I'll be the most stylish person of all at this party, she said contentedly to herself as she rang the doorbell. Okay. She's not coming across the way that I think she wanted to. A little startling to one of the ladies. In the Stutzigren's living room sat three fine ladies, and with them Tommy, Annika, and their mother. A wonderful coffee table had been spread, and in the fireplace a fire was burning brightly. The ladies were talking quietly with one another, and Tommy and Annika were sitting on the sofa looking at an album. Everything was so peaceful. Suddenly the peace was shattered. Attention! A piercing cry came from the hall, and the next minute Pippi Longstocking stood in the doorway. She cried out so loudly and so unexpectedly that the ladies had jumped in their seats. Forward march, came the next command, and Pippi, with measured steps, walked up to Mrs. Stutzigren. Halt! She stopped. Arms forward, 1, 2, she cried, and with both hands gripping one of Mrs. Stutzigren's, she shook it heartily. Knees bend, she shrieked and curtsied prettily. And then she smiled at Mrs. Stutzigren and said in her ordinary voice, you see, I am really very shy. So if I didn't give myself some commands, I'd just stand in the hall and not dare to come in. And then she rushed up to the other ladies and kissed them on the cheek. Charming, charming, upon my honor, said she, for she had once heard a stylish gentleman say that to a lady. And then she sat down in the best chair she could find. Mrs. Stutzigren had intended the children to have their party up in Tommy and Annika's room, but Pippi stayed calmly in her chair, slapped herself on the knee, and said, looking at the coffee table, oh, that certainly looks good. When do we begin? At that moment, Ella, the maid, came in with a coffee pot, and Mrs. Stutzigren said, please come and have some coffee. First, cried Pippi, and she was up by the table in two skips. She heaped as many cakes as she could onto a plate. She threw 5 lumps of sugar into a coffee cup, emptied half the cream pitcher into her cup, and was back in her chair with her lute, even before the ladies had reached the table. Pippi stretched her legs out in front of her and placed the plate of cakes between her toes. And then she merrily dunked cakes in her coffee cup and stuffed so many in her mouth at once, she couldn't have uttered a word no matter how hard she tried. In the twinkling of an eye, she had finished all the cakes on the plate. She got up, struck the plate as if it were a tambourine, and went up to the table to see if there were any cakes left. The ladies looked disapprovingly at her, but that didn't bother Pippi. Chatting gaily, she walked around the table, snatching a cake here and a cake there. Oh, it's certainly nice of you to invite me, she said. I've never been to a coffee party before. On the table stood a large cream pie, decorated in the center with a piece of red candy. Pippi stood with her hands behind her back and looked at it. Suddenly, she bent down and snatched the candy with her teeth. But she died down a little too hastily, and when she came up again, her whole face was covered with whipped cream. Oh, goody, laughed Pippi. Now we can play blindsman bluff, for we certainly got a blind man all made to order. I can't see a thing. She stuck out her tongue and licked away the cream. Oh, this was indeed a dreadful accident, she said, and the pie is all ruined now anyway, so I might as well eat it all up at once. Pippi dug into the pie with the pie server, and in a few minutes, the whole pie had disappeared. Pippi patted her stomach contentedly. Mrs. Stetsengred had gone into the kitchen, so she knew nothing about the accident to the cream pie. But the other ladies looked very sternly at Pippi. No doubt they would have liked a little pie too. Pippi noticed that they looked disappointed and decided to cheer them up. Oh, you mustn't feel bad about such a little accident, she said comfortingly. The main thing is we all have our health, and at a coffee party, you should have fun. Pippi then picked up a sugar bowl and tipped all the lump sugar in it on the floor. Well, my goodness, she cried. Now look what I had done. How could I have made such a mistake? I thought this was granulated sugar. Oh, bad luck does seem to follow me today. Thereupon, Pippi took a sugar spoon out of another bowl, and she began to sprinkle granulated sugar all over the floor. I hope you notice, she said, that this is the kind of sugar you sprinkle on things. So it's perfectly all right for me to do this, because why would there be this kind of sugar to sprinkle on things if somebody doesn't go and sprinkle it? That's what I'd like to know. Have you ever noticed what fun it is to walk on a floor that has had sugar sprinkled all over it? Of course, it's even more fun when you're barefooted. And Pippi pulled off her shoes and stockings. You ought to try it because nothing's more fun. Believe me, she said to the 3 ladies. At that moment, Mrs. Stetsengred came in, and when she saw sugar all over her floor, she took Pippi by the arm and led her over to the sofa to Tommy and Annika. And then she went over to the ladies and invited them to have more coffee. That the cream pie had disappeared only made her happy because she thought the ladies had liked it so much they had eaten it all up. Pippi, Tommy, and Annika sat talking quietly on the sofa. The fire crackled on the hearth. The ladies drank their coffee, and all was quiet and peaceful again. And as so often happens at coffee parties, the ladies began to talk about their servant problems. Apparently, they had not been able to get very good servants, for they were not at all satisfied with them. And they agreed it was really much better not to have any servants at all. It was much more satisfactory to do things yourself, because then you at least knew that things were done right. Pippi sat on the sofa listening, and after the ladies had been talking a while, she said, once my grandmother had a servant named Marlin. She had chilblains on her feet, but otherwise there was nothing wrong with her. The only other annoying thing was, as soon as company came, she would rush at them and she would bite their legs and bark. Oh, how she would bark. You could hear it all through the neighborhood, but it was only because she was playful. Only, of course, strangers didn't always understand that. The dean's wife, an elderly woman, came to see grandmother once, soon after Marlin first came. And when Marlin came dashing at her and bit her in the ankle, the dean's wife screamed so loudly it scared Marlin, so that her teeth clamped together and she couldn't get them apart. And there she sat, stuck to the dean's wife's ankle until Friday. And grandmother had to peel potatoes herself. But at least it was well done. Grandmother peeled so well that when she was done, there were no potatoes left, only peelings. But after that Friday, the dean's wife never came to call on grandmother again. She just never could take a joke. And poor Marlin, who was always so good-natured and happy, though for that matter, she was a little touchy at times. There's no denying that. Once, when grandmother poked a fork in her ear, she howled all day. Pippi looked around and smiled pleasantly. Yes, that was Marlin for you, she said, twiddling her thumbs. The ladies acted as if they had heard nothing, and they continued to talk. Oh, if my Rosa were only clean, said Mrs. Bernwig, then maybe I could keep her, but she's a regular pig. Hey, say, you ought to have seen Marlin, Pippi interrupted. Marlin was so outrageously dirty that it was a joy to see her, grandmother always said. For the longest time, grandmother thought she had a very dark complexion, but honest and true, it was nothing but dirt that would wash off. And once at a bazaar at the city hotel, she got first prize for the dirt under her nails. Mercy me, how dirty that girl was, said Pippi happily. Mrs. Stetson-Gred looked at her sternly. Can you imagine, said Mrs. Granberg, the other evening when Greta was going out, she borrowed my blue satin dress without even asking for it. Isn't that dreadful? Oh, yes, indeed, said Pippi. She certainly seems to be cut from the same piece of cloth as Marilyn, from what you say. Grandmother had a pink undershirt she was especially fond of, but the worst of it was that Merlin liked it too. And every morning, grandmother and Marlin argued about who was going to wear the undershirt. At last, they decided it would be fair to take turns and each wear it every other day. But imagine how that tricky Marlin could be. Sometimes she'd come running in when it wasn't her turn at all and say, no mashed turnips today if I can't wear the pink woolen undershirt. Well, what was grandmother to do? Mashed turnips was her very favorite dish. There was nothing for it but to let Marlin have the shirt. As soon as Marlin got the shirt, she went out into the kitchen as nice as could be and began to mash turnip so that it splattered all over the walls. Oh, there was silence for a little while. And then Mrs. Alexanderson said, I'm not absolutely certain, but I strongly suspect that my Huda steals. In fact, I've noticed that things disappear. Oh, began Pippi. Marlin, oh, she couldn't even finish her sentence because Mrs. Stetson-Gred interrupted her. Children, she said decidedly, go up to the nursery immediately. Yes, but I was only going to say that Marlin stole too, said Pippi, like a raven, everything she could get her hands on. She used to get up in the middle of the night and steal. Otherwise, she couldn't sleep well, she said. Once she stole grandmother's piano, and she tucked it into her own top bureau drawer. She was very clever with her hands, grandmother said. Tommy and Annika took hold of Pippi and pulled her out of the room and up the stairs. The ladies began on their third cups of coffee, and Mrs. Stetson-Gren said, it's not that I want to complain about my Ella, but she does break the china. A red head appeared over the stair railing. Speaking of Marlin, said Pippi, maybe you're wondering if she ever used to break any china? Well, she did. She set apart one day a week just to break china. It was Tuesday, grandmother said. As early as 5 o'clock on Tuesday morning, you could hear this jewel of a maid in the kitchen breaking china. She began with coffee cups and glasses and little things like that. And then she went on to the soup bowls and dinner plates. And she finished up with platters and soup tureens. There was such a crash bang in the kitchen all morning, it was a joy to hear, grandmother said. And if Marlin had any spare time late in the afternoon, she would go into the drawing room with a little hammer and knock down the antique East Indian plates that were hanging on the wall. Grandmother bought new china every Wednesday, said Pippi, and disappeared up the stairs as quickly as a jack-in-the-box. But now Mrs. Stetsongred's patience had come to an end. She ran up the stairs into the nursery and up to Pippi, who had just begun to teach Tommy to stand on his head. You must never come here again, said Mrs. Stetsongred, if you can't behave any better than this. Pippi looked at her in astonishment, and her eyes slowly filled up with tears. Oh, that's just what I was afraid of, she said, that I couldn't behave properly. Oh, it's no use to try. I'll never learn. I should have stayed on the ocean. She curtsied to Mrs. Stetsongred and said goodbye to Tommy and Annika and went slowly down the stairs. The ladies were now ready to go home. Pippi sat down in the hall near the shelf where the rubbers were kept and watched the ladies putting on their hats and coats. Too bad you don't like your maid, said she. You should have had one like Marlin. Grandmother always said there was nobody like her. Imagine one Christmas when Marlin was going to serve a little roast pig. Do you know what she did? She had read in the cookbooks that roast pig must be served with frilled paper in the ears and an apple in the mouth. But poor Marlin didn't understand that it was a pig who was supposed to have the apple. You should have seen her when she came in on Christmas Eve with her best apron on and a big apple in her mouth. Oh, Marlin, you're crazy, grandmother said to her. And Marlin couldn't say a word in her own defense. She could only wiggle her ears until the frilled paper rustled. To be sure, she had tried to say something, but it just sounded like blah, 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 blah. And of course, she couldn't bite people in the leg as she usually did. And it would be a day when there was a lot of company. Poor little Marlin, it wasn't a very happy Christmas Eve for her, said Pippi sadly. The ladies were now dressed and said a last goodbye to Mrs. Stetsongred. And Pippi ran up to her and whispered, forgive me, because I couldn't behave myself. Goodbye. Then she put on her large hat and followed the ladies. Outside the gate, their ways parted. Pippi went towards Villa Vocala and the ladies in the other direction. When they had gone a little while, they heard someone panting behind them. It was Pippi, who had come racing back. You can imagine that grandmother mourned when she lost Marlin. Just think, one Tuesday morning, when Marlin had had time to break only about a dozen teacups, she ran away and went to sea. And grandmother had to break the china herself that day. And she wasn't used to it, poor thing. She got blisters all over her hands. She never saw Marlin again. And that was a shame because she was such an excellent maid. Grandmother always said that. Pippi laughed and the ladies hurried on. But when they'd gone a couple of 100 feet, they heard Pippi from far off yelling at the top of her lungs, and she never swept under the beds. That is Pippi Longstocking for today. And the book that I chose, I went to a place called the Book Barn on the Connecticut shore. And you can imagine how I would feel being at a whole barn full of books. It was pretty fabulous. And this, as you can see, is a beautifully drawn cat from a fairy tale by the French author Charles Perrault, and it's illustrated by Fred Marcelio. So this is about a very smart, wise cat. And we'll get to read it and talk about behaving. This cat knew how to behave, so a little underhanded. It's called Puss in the Boots. Let's see. Okay, so there's a young man and he's looking very sad. Here's his cat next to him. These are his brothers, and this is the mill that was owned by their father. Okay, maybe that's the older brother, the middle brother, and he is the youngest brother. A miller had 3 sons, and when he died, he left them nothing but his mill, his donkey, and his cat. The sons didn't send for a lawyer because they knew their whole legacy would have gone for fees. But it didn't take them long to decide who would get what. The eldest got the mill, the second got the donkey, and nothing was left for the youngest but the cat. He wasn't very happy about it. Oh, my brothers will be able to work together and make a decent living, he said. But once I've eaten my cat and made a muff out of her fur, I'm sure to starve. The cat, who had been listening while pretending not to, said with a serious, sympathetic look, "Don't worry, master. Just get me a sack and a pair of boots to carry me through the brambles, and you'll see that you haven't come out as badly as you think." The cat's master was not exactly convinced, but then he remembered that he had seen the cat do some very clever things, such as catching rats and mice by hanging by his paws, or hiding in the flour and playing dead. So he said to himself, "Oh, well, why not give it a try?" When Puss had got what he asked for, he pulled on his fine boots, threw the sack over his shoulder, and holding the strings between his forepaws, went out to a warden where there would be lots of rabbits. And there he is. Okay, here's putting on the boots. He's gone to the cobbler, and you see a pair of boots hanging down from the storefront. And I guess they fit just right. And there's the sack. Now, what is he going to do with the sack? Oh, he put bran and sow thistle in the sack, and he waited for some young rabbit who hadn't caught on to the ruses of this world to poke his nose into the sack. No sooner had he settled himself than a harebrained young rabbit walked right in. Puss pulled the strings tight and killed the rabbit without mercy or compassion. And there's a little rabbit, and he's curious about what's inside. Uh-oh, there's Puss. He's getting ready to catch it. Proud of his kill, Puss went straight to the royal palace and asked to see the king. They showed him into his majesty's apartments, where he bowed low and said, "Sire, I have brought you a wild rabbit, which the Marquis of Carabas," that was the name Puss had decided to give his master, "has bidden me to offer you with his compliments." "Tell your master," said the king, "that his gift has given me great pleasure, and that I thank him kindly." The next time Puss went out with his sack, he hid in a wheat field. When two partridges walked into the sack, he pulled the strings and caught them both. The king accepted the two partridges gladly and told his servants to reward the cat for his pains. For 2 or 3 months, Puss went on bringing the king game from his master's preserve. And there's Puss. There's the king and his court. And there's the latest offering. That's the rabbit. Then one day, when he knew that the king would be going for a ride along the river with his daughter, who was the most beautiful princess in the whole world, Puss said to his master, "Do as I say, and your fortune is made. Just go for a swim in the river. I'll show you the exact spot and leave the rest to me." The Marquis of Carabas followed Puss's instructions to the letter, though he couldn't imagine what good it would do him. While he was swimming, the king passed by, and Puss shouted with all of his might, "Help! Help! The Marquis of Carabas is drowning." Okay, here's Puss telling his master what to do. And there he is in the tree, screaming for help. Hearing the shouts, the king stuck his head out of the carriage door and recognized the cat who had brought him so much game. "Hurry!" he called out to his guards. "Hurry to the rescue of the Marquis of Carabas." While the poor Marquis was being pulled out of the river, Puss went over to the carriage and spoke to the king. "While my master was swimming," he said, "some thieves came and made off with his clothes, even though I yelled, 'Stop thief!' at the top of my voice. The rascal cat had hidden them under a stone and was just pretending that they were lost." Okay, there's the man, the young man, supposedly the Marquis, and he doesn't even know he's supposed to be drowning. There's the king in the carriage, and there they are rescuing him. Really doesn't need rescuing at all, does he? It's all a trick. The king ordered the officers of the wardrobe to fetch one of his finest suits for the Marquis of Carabas. Once the Marquis had changed, the king made a great fuss over him, and since the fine clothes brought out his good looks, the king's daughter took a liking to him too. The Marquis gave her 2 or 3 tender glances, and before you knew it, she had fallen in love with him. The king proposed that he join them for a carriage ride. Oh, he does look very fine indeed. What a gorgeous suit. Here's the king, and there's the beautiful princess. Aha, the plot thickens. Delighted that his plan was turning out so well, Puss went on ahead of the carriage. When he saw some peasants mowing a meadow, he said to them, "Prince, I want you to tell the king that this meadow belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, and if you don't, you'll be cut up as small as sausage meat." Uh-oh, he's definitely threatening them. And there they are, just going about their daily business. Okay. And there's the cat. There's Puss right up there, shouting out orders. So the king's carriage is going to come by. When the king came along, he asked the mowers who owned the meadow they were mowing. Puss's threat had scared them out of their wits, and they answered in unison, "The Marquis of Carabas owns it." "A fine meadow you've got there," said the king to the Marquis. "Yes, indeed, sire," said the Marquis. "Year in, year out, it yields a goodly crop." Puss, who was still going on ahead, saw some harvesters and said to them, "I want you to say that all this wheat belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, and if you don't, you'll be cut up into sausage meat." The king, who came along a few moments later, wanted to know who owned all the wheat he was looking at. "The Marquis of Carabas," said the harvesters, and again the king was well pleased with the Marquis. Puss, who was going on ahead of the carriage, kept saying the same thing to all the people he met, and the king marveled at the size of the Marquis's estates. And there's the king in the carriage, asking the harvesters who owned all this wheat. And there's Puss in the Boots, going ahead, threatening everybody, telling them what to do, telling them what to say. At last, Puss came to a beautiful castle that belonged to an org. He was the richest org in the world, for all the lands the king had passed through belonged to him. Puss, who had been careful to find out all about this org, went into the castle and asked leave to call on him. "What a pity it would be," he said, "to be so near his castle and not stop and pay my respects." The org welcomed him as affably as an org can and bade him to be seated. "I have been told," said Puss, "that you can turn yourself into any animal you please, a lion, for instance, or even an elephant." "That is true," said the org, "and to prove it, I'll turn myself into a lion." There they are. There's the org, who is gigantic, and there's Puss. And there's Puss going into his castle. All right, let's see what happens. Uh-oh. Oh, Puss was so terrified at the sight of the lion right in that room that he scrambled up into the roof, which wasn't easy because boots are no good for walking on tiles, and it was dangerous besides. A little later, when Puss saw the org was the org again, he came down and admitted the lion had given him a bad scare. I think I would be terrified too. Lion is knocking everything off the table. And there's Puss right by the window, trying to escape up higher. Okay, let's see how he's going to get out of this one. When he had caught his breath, Puss said, "I hear you can turn yourself into a small animal also, a rat or a mouse, for instance. Oh, well, that does seem impossible." "Oh, it seems impossible, does it?" said the org. A second later, the org was gone, and a mouse was scurrying across the floor. Puss pounced on it, caught it, and gobbled the org up. Okay, there he is. He's challenging him to turn into something small. And there, you can see, there's the org turned into a little tiny mouse. And easy catch for Puss. Just then, the king came to the beautiful castle, and of course he wanted to go in. When Puss heard the sound of the carriage rumbling over the drawbridge, he ran out to meet the king. "Welcome, your majesty," he said, "to the Marquis of Carabas's castle." "Oh, my dear Marquis," cried the king, "is it possible that this castle is yours too? What could be more beautiful than this courtyard and all these buildings around it. Let's have a look inside. The Marquise gave the young princess his hand, and the king led the way, and all went in. In the great hall, they found a banquet that the orc had ordered for his friends. These friends had just arrived, but when they saw the king's carriage, they ran away. The king was charmed by the Marquis's manners and estates, and the king's daughter had favored him right from the first. So, after 5 or 6 beakers of wine, the king said to him, "You have only to say the word, my dear Marquis, and I'll take you for my son-in-law." The Marquis said the word with a low, elaborate bow and married the princess that same day. Shows you some more of the castle yard. And there's the Marquis bowing. And there's the princess in love with him. And there is Puss. The plans have turned out exactly as he wanted them to be. And this is the last, almost the last page. So it shows them at the table, the huge banquet table, having their wine with their own guest, having the marriage feast. And where is Puss? Right there, taking a well-deserved sleep, and the boots are off. Okay, turn the page, and there is a great portrait of Puss, who became a great lord and gave up chasing mice, except just once in a while, for the fun of it. And there's his picture, and there's 2 little mice pointing him out. Puss and the boots. That is a very, very famous fairy story. Okay, whoops.